Good morning.
Good morning.
Today we're going to talk about light and things that shine within us and without us. The focus on the reading from Exodus was that Moses, after he went up Mount Sinai and heard the voice of God, would come back down with his skin glowing. And it was glowing so much that his people could see him from a far distance. And they didn't know what it was, but they were afraid of it. And they kept their distance. So he adopted the policy of covering his face with a veil when he was down in the lower regions with the people he was leading, and then he would put the veil back on when he went back up the mountain to listen to God. He, of course, did not see God because God had told him, "No one can see me and live." Now, we can only imagine how that felt for Moses to be up on top of this mountain listening to the voice of God, and then go back down to the people that he was leading, who he called more than once a stiff-necked people. And he used to lose his patience with them. We're going to talk about another incident with some other people on a mountain seeing a different light. And this comes from the Gospel of Luke, the 9th chapter, beginning with the 28th verse. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Now, of course, what we call this is the transfiguration. And Merriam-Webster defines transfiguration as a change in form or appearance, or a metamorphosis. Metamorphosis being something like what a butterfly undergoes. And the second definition is an exalting, glorifying, or spiritual change. So back to the reading. Suddenly they, Peter, James, and John, saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with them. And just as they were leaving, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. Now, some of the older translations word that as he didn't know what he was saying. In other words, he was babbling. I don't know if any of you have ever met anybody famous, but if you're like me, you tend to gush and not know afterwards exactly what you said. That happened to me once. I met Hank Snow backstage at the Grand Ole Opry. And when it was over, I told my wife, "I don't remember a thing I said." She said, "You gushed." But at the time, I didn't know what I was saying. And so this is the way that Peter was. He'd gone up on the mountains and with Jesus, and of course he'd been following Jesus around for a while. He'd seen miracles. He'd seen some stuff that most people don't see ever. But this was a new one. This was a brand new one. Because Jesus' face changed and his clothes became dazzling white. He just sparkled. He shone. Now, as far as saying, let us make 3 dwellings, there's some different definitions of that too. Some readings call it booths, others tents, shelters, tabernacles, huts. Why was he so anxious to build something there? Now, I thought for a long time that maybe he thought that they would all just live up there and they would each have their own shelter. But that's not quite it at all. According to some scholars, what Peter wanted to do was to freeze the moment. He wanted to seize that moment, freeze it, keep it forever. And what he wanted to erect was a monument or a shrine to this moment. Now these days, a person would just whip out their iPhone and take a picture of it. They might even bring out some hand-carried device and make a movie of it, and perhaps preserve it that way. But this was 2,000 years ago, and they didn't have the technology. The only technology that existed really was writing things down. And the way that things were conveyed was by word of mouth. And these stories weren't conveyed for a long time. So the only picture that we have of this is our mental picture. Now, if you ever think of the word imagination, imagine, the root word of imagination is image. And what you do is you visualize something in your mind, and that becomes your picture, your mental picture.